The morning mist hung low over the rolling hills of Harmony Creek, Pennsylvania, a place where time seemed to move at its own gentle pace. Horse-drawn buggies traveled the quiet country roads, and the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves on pavement was as familiar as birdsong. This was a world apart from the hustle and bustle of modern life, a community where faith, family, and farming formed the foundation of daily existence. But in the fall of 2005, something happened here that would shatter the peaceful tranquility of this close-knit Amish settlement. Two sisters, Sarah and Rebecca Stoltzfus, left their family farm on a routine errand in their horse-drawn wagon. They were expected back by nightfall. They never returned. The wagon, the horse, the girls, all vanished without a trace, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. For 10 long years, their disappearance remained one of Pennsylvania's most baffling mysteries. No evidence, no witnesses, no explanation. Just an empty space where 2 young lives should have been. Then, in 2015, a team of geologists exploring an abandoned mine made a discovery that would finally reveal the truth. A truth more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The Stoltzfus family lived on a modest farm about 3 miles outside the main settlement of Harmony Creek. Jacob Stoltzfus was a man of deep faith and few words, known throughout the community for his skill as a carpenter and his devotion to the old ways. His wife, Esther, was equally respected, a gentle soul who made the best apple butter in 3 counties and could often be found tending to sick neighbors or helping with new babies. They had been blessed with 2 daughters. Sarah, the eldest at 18, carried herself with a quiet dignity that reminded many of her mother. She had her father's steady hands and serious demeanor, taking her responsibilities as the older sister with the gravity of someone who understood her role in the family hierarchy. Sarah could milk a cow faster than most grown men, and her needlework was so fine that women twice her age sought her advice on difficult patterns. She rarely smiled, but when she did, it transformed her whole face, making her look younger than her years. Rebecca, at 16, was cut from different cloth. Where Sarah was earth and stone, Rebecca was wind and water. She had a quick laugh and bright eyes that held a spark of curiosity about the world beyond their farm. Not that she was rebellious, no one would ever say that about Rebecca Stoltzfus, but she asked questions that made the elders shift uncomfortably in their seats. Why did the English use electricity? What was it like in the cities she sometimes glimpsed from hilltops? She loved to read, devouring every book the community library would allow, and she had a gift with animals that bordered on the mystical. Even the most stubborn mule would gentle under her touch. October 15th, 2005, dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that made the harvest season feel like a blessing rather than hard work. The leaves on the maple trees had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, and the air carried the sweet scent of apples ready for picking. It was a Saturday, which meant market day in the nearby English town of Mill Grove, about 8 miles from the Stoltzfus farm. The family had been preparing for this trip all week. Esther had spent days making preserves, strawberry jam, pickled beets, and her famous apple butter. Sarah had helped her mother while Rebecca tended to the chickens and gathered eggs to sell. Jacob had crafted several small wooden toys and decorative boxes that always sold well to tourists who came looking for authentic Amish goods. The plan was simple and routine. The girls would take the wagon to Mill Grove, sell their goods at the farmer's market, and use the money to purchase supplies the family needed for winter. Fabric for new clothes, lamp oil, feed for the animals, and perhaps a few special treats if sales were good. They had made this trip dozens of times before, sometimes together, sometimes separately. The road to Mill Grove was well-traveled and considered safe, passing through farmland and forest but never straying far from civilization. That morning, Jacob helped his daughters load the wagon while Esther packed them a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and dried fruit. Sarah wore her best bonnet, the one with the tiny blue flowers embroidered along the edge, a detail so subtle that only those who looked closely would notice. Rebecca had brushed their horse, Samuel, until his dark coat gleamed in the morning sun. Samuel was getting on in years but was still strong and steady, the kind of horse you could trust with your life. As the girls prepared to leave, Esther pressed a small cloth purse into Sarah's hand. Inside was the money they would need to make change at the market, along with a carefully written list of supplies to purchase. Rebecca climbed onto the wagon seat first, gathering her dark skirts around her, then helped her sister up. Sarah took the reins with practiced ease. Jacob stood beside the wagon, one weathered hand on Samuel's bridle. He spoke a few words in Pennsylvania Dutch, reminding them to be careful, to mind their business in town, and to return before dark. The sun would set early now that autumn had arrived, and he didn't want them traveling the forest road in darkness. Esther emerged from the house with a jar of water for the journey. She handed it up to Rebecca, then touched each daughter's hand in turn, a gesture of blessing and farewell that was as natural as breathing in their world. Neither parent lingered over the goodbye. This was just another Saturday, another market day, another ordinary moment in a life built on routine and tradition. As the wagon rolled down the dirt drive toward the main road, Esther returned to her kitchen to begin preparing the noon meal. Jacob walked to the barn to continue his woodworking. If they had known it would be the last time they would see their daughters, surely they would have watched until the wagon disappeared from view. Surely they would have called out one more time, held them one moment longer. But they didn't know. No one ever does. The girls should have returned by 4 o'clock at the latest. The market closed at 2, and even allowing time for shopping and the journey home, 4 was the absolute latest they would arrive. When 5 o'clock came and went with no sign of the wagon, Esther began to pace the kitchen. Jacob tried to reassure her. Perhaps Samuel had thrown a shoe. Perhaps the girls had met friends and lost track of time. Perhaps sales had been so good they needed extra time to purchase all the supplies. By 6 o'clock, with darkness beginning to creep across the sky, Jacob could no longer ignore the growing knot of worry in his chest. He hitched up their other horse and rode toward town, expecting to meet his daughters on the road, perhaps dealing with a broken wagon wheel or some other minor catastrophe. He traveled all the way to Millgrove without seeing them. At the market square, now mostly deserted, he found a few vendors packing up their remaining goods. Yes, they remembered the Stoltzfus girls. They had arrived around 9 that morning, sold everything they brought, and left around 1 o'clock with their wagon loaded with supplies. One vendor specifically remembered helping them load several heavy bags of feed. They had seemed in good spirits, Rebecca laughing at something her sister had said. There was no indication of any problem, no mention of planning to go anywhere else. Jacob rode home faster than was safe in the growing darkness, hoping against hope that he had somehow missed them, that they would be waiting at the farm with some simple explanation. But the house was dark except for the lamp Esther had lit in the window, a beacon for her missing daughters. By now, word had spread through the Amish community with the swift efficiency of a people who relied on each other for everything. Neighbors began arriving, men with lanterns ready to search, women to comfort Esther and help with preparations. The search began that very night. Dozens of Amish men spread out along the road between Harmony Creek and Mill Grove, their lanterns creating a constellation of moving lights in the darkness. They called out for Sarah and Rebecca, their voices echoing through the forest. They searched ditches and ravines, thinking perhaps the wagon had overturned. They checked every side road, every path, every place where 2 girls might have gone. As dawn broke on Sunday morning, the search expanded. The Amish community, despite their usual reluctance to involve outside authorities, contacted the county sheriff. By noon, over 200 people were searching, Amish and English working side by side, setting aside their differences in the face of crisis. Search dogs were brought in, given items of the girls' clothing to track their scent. The dogs followed the trail from the market to the edge of town, down the main road toward Harmony Creek. Then, about 3 miles from town, at a spot where the road curved through a thick stand of pine trees, the trail simply ended. Not at a river where the scent might have been washed away. Not at a busy intersection where other smells might have confused the dogs. The trail just stopped, as if the wagon, horse, and girls had simply vanished into thin air. Investigators were baffled. There were no skid marks indicating a struggle or sudden stop, no broken branches or disturbed ground suggesting the wagon had left the road. No dropped items, no blood, no signs of violence whatsoever. Even more puzzling, no one reported seeing the wagon after it left Mill Grove. On a Saturday afternoon, on a main road, someone should have passed them. Someone should have seen something. But no one had. The sheriff's department conducted extensive interviews. They questioned everyone at the market, everyone who lived along the road, everyone who might have had any interaction with the girls. They investigated whether the sisters might have had romantic interests their parents didn't know about, whether they might have chosen to leave the Amish life. But everyone who knew Sarah and Rebecca insisted this was impossible. Sarah was too devoted to her family and faith. Rebecca, despite her curiosity about the outside world, would never have left without word, would never have caused her parents such pain. The English newspapers picked up the story, running headlines about the missing Amish sisters. Photographs of Sarah and Rebecca, taken by a tourist at the market just weeks before their disappearance, were circulated widely. The images showed 2 young women in traditional dress, Sarah looking serious and dignified, Rebecca with just the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Tips poured in from across the state, supposed sightings and theories, but none led anywhere. A trucker claimed he saw an Amish wagon being loaded onto a flatbed truck, but couldn't provide any details about location or license plates. A woman insisted she had seen two Amish girls at a bus station in Philadelphia, but security footage proved she was mistaken. As days turned to weeks, the official search was scaled back. The sheriff's department kept the case open but had no leads to follow. The FBI briefly investigated, considering the possibility of a federal crime, but found no evidence to pursue. For the Amish community, the disappearance became a wound that wouldn't heal. They continued searching on their own, organizing groups to comb through forests and fields. They prayed together, held special services, and tried to support the Stoltzfus family through their unimaginable grief. Jacob aged 10 years in as many weeks. His strong frame seemed to shrink, his shoulders permanently bent as if carrying an invisible weight. He continued his carpentry work, but his hands shook sometimes, ruining pieces he would have completed perfectly before. Esther stopped making apple butter entirely. She couldn't bear the smell of it, the memory of her daughters helping her stir the great copper pot. She still cooked and cleaned and went through the motions of daily life, but neighbors noticed she would sometimes stop in the middle of a task, staring at nothing, lost in some private anguish. Winter came early that year, blanketing Harmony Creek in snow by mid-November. The physical search became impossible, but the Stoltzfus family and their community never stopped looking in their own ways. Every prayer service included a plea for the girls' safe return. Every gathering included updates, no matter how small, about any possible leads. Some families hired private investigators with their own money, desperate for answers the authorities couldn't provide. But as winter turned to spring, then summer, then another autumn, hope began to fade. The case went cold, officially and unofficially. The sheriff's department filed the case away with other unsolved disappearances. The newspaper stopped running update stories. Even within the Amish community, the daily mentions became weekly, then monthly. A year after the disappearance, the community held a memorial service. Not a funeral, without bodies, without answers. They couldn't properly lay the girls to rest, but a service of remembrance, of prayer, of trying to find peace with questions that might never be answered. Jacob and Esther sat in the front row, surrounded by family and friends, but utterly alone in their grief. Some well-meaning relatives suggested they consider having more children, starting again, but Esther was past that time of life. And besides, how could you replace what was irreplaceable? Years passed with a cruel sameness. Each October 15th, Jacob and Esther would stand at the end of their drive, watching the empty road, some part of them still expecting to see a wagon appear, to hear Rebecca's laugh and see Sarah's serious face. They left the girls' room exactly as it was, beds made, clothes hanging on pegs, as if preparing for a return that grew less likely with each passing day. The community never forgot, but life moved on as life does. Other children grew up, married, and had children of their own. Other tragedies and joys occurred. The Stoltzfus sisters became a cautionary tale, a mystery that parents mentioned to children who wanted to venture too far from home. Some people developed theories. Perhaps the girls had been taken by someone with a grudge against the Amish. Perhaps they had witnessed something they shouldn't have and been silenced. Perhaps it was a crime of opportunity, a predator who saw two vulnerable young women and acted on terrible impulse. But theories were all they were. Without evidence, without bodies, without any trace of what had happened on that October afternoon, there were no answers, only questions that echoed through the years like ghosts. In 2015, a decade after the disappearance, Jacob Stoltzfus had been dead for 2 years, his heart finally giving out under the weight of grief he had carried for so long. Esther lived with relatives now, her mind beginning to fade, though she still asked about her daughters every day, forgetting sometimes that they had been gone for years. The farm had been sold to another Amish family who knew its history and treated the land with appropriate respect. And then, in late September of that year, something happened that would finally bring answers to questions that had haunted a community for a decade. The state of Pennsylvania had recently acquired a large tract of land in the mountains about 15 miles from Harmony Creek. The land had been in private hands for over a century, owned by the same family who had done little with it except post no trespassing signs and chase away anyone who ventured too close. When the last member of that family died without heirs, the state claimed the property for back taxes and began surveying it for possible use as a nature preserve. Part of that survey involved investigating several old iron mines that dated back to the 1800s. The mines had been abandoned for decades, their entrances overgrown and partially collapsed. A team of geologists from Penn State University received permission to explore these mines as part of a study on historical mining practices and their environmental impact. The team consisted of Dr. Margaret Chen, a veteran geologist with 30 years of experience, and 2 graduate students, Tom Bradley and Jennifer Martinez. They arrived at the site on a foggy Monday morning, equipped with powerful lights, safety equipment, and various instruments for taking measurements and samples. The first 2 mines they explored were relatively shallow, extending only a few hundred feet into the mountainside before ending in collapsed tunnels. They documented what they found: old mining equipment, cart tracks, evidence of the hard labor that had once taken place here. The third mine was different. The entrance was larger, more carefully constructed with massive timber supports that had somehow survived the decades. As they ventured inside, their lights illuminated walls that showed sophisticated engineering for the era. This had been a major operation once, with multiple branching tunnels and evidence of extensive excavation. About 300 feet into the main tunnel, they came to a large chamber where several smaller tunnels converged. Dr. Chen was explaining to her students how such chambers were used as gathering points for ore, when Tom's light swept across something that made him gasp. Against the far wall of the chamber, partially visible behind a pile of collapsed timber, was what appeared to be the remains of a wooden wagon wheel. As they approached, moving carefully across the uneven ground, more details emerged from the darkness. It wasn't just a wheel, it was an entire wagon, or what was left of one. The wood was partially decomposed but preserved by the cool, dry conditions of the mine. And there, still attached to the wagon by leather straps that had turned black with age, were the skeletal remains of a horse. Dr. Chen immediately recognized the significance of their discovery. This wasn't mining equipment. This was something else entirely. She ordered her students not to disturb anything and called the authorities. Within hours, the abandoned mine was swarming with police, forensic experts, and investigators. The wagon was examined carefully, photographed from every angle, each piece of rotted wood and rusted metal cataloged. It was definitely an Amish wagon, the construction and style consistent with those used by the local community. But it was what they found near the wagon that sent shockwaves through the investigation. Scattered on the ground, partially buried under years of dust and debris, were items that had survived the decade. A few coins dated 2005, the metal clasps from what had once been a purse, and most significantly, a small brass button of the type used on traditional Amish dresses. The forensic team expanded their search, bringing in ground-penetrating radar and other equipment. They found no human remains in the mine itself, which raised more questions than answers. How had the wagon and horse ended up here? Where were the people who had been traveling in it? Meanwhile, investigators had begun researching the land's ownership history. The property had belonged to a man named Silas Kane, who had inherited it from his father in the 1970s. Silas had been something of a local legend, though not in a good way. He was known as a recluse, a bitter man who rarely came to town and had no friends to speak of. He had a particular hatred for the Amish community, stemming from an incident in the 1980s when an Amish family had successfully sued him over a land boundary dispute. Neighbors remembered him making threats, saying the Amish were parasites who didn't belong in modern America. Silas had died in 2013 at the age of 78, found dead in his farmhouse by a utility worker who had come to shut off his power for non-payment. The house had been in terrible condition, filled with garbage and showing signs of serious neglect. The county had done a basic search of the property at the time, but found nothing of particular interest. The house had been condemned and left standing, too expensive to demolish and too remote to matter. Now, with the discovery in the mine, investigators obtained a warrant to search the abandoned farmhouse more thoroughly. The building was a hazard, with rotting floorboards and a partially collapsed roof, but they proceeded carefully, documenting everything. Most of what they found was worthless: old newspapers, broken furniture, the detritus of a life lived in isolation, and anger. But in the attic, hidden beneath a loose floorboard that an investigator noticed only because it didn't match the dust pattern of the surrounding boards, they found a journal. The journal was wrapped in plastic, preserved deliberately, as if Silas had wanted it to survive. The first entries were from years before, rambling complaints about neighbors, the government, and especially the Amish. But as investigators read further, they found entries from October 2005 that made their blood run cold. The entries started normally enough for Silas, complaints about trespassers and descriptions of his daily activities. But the entry for October 15th was different. In shaky handwriting, Silas had written about hearing a crash near the old mine road while he was out checking his property for poachers. He described finding an Amish wagon that had gone off the road after the horse was apparently spooked by a deer that had jumped in front of it. The wagon had rolled down a steep embankment into a ravine near one of the mine entrances. He wrote that he found one girl already dead, her neck broken in the fall. The horse was also dead, its legs shattered. But the other girl was alive, injured, but conscious, trapped under the overturned wagon. Instead of going for help, instead of showing basic human compassion, Silas saw an opportunity. He wrote about his hatred for the Amish, how they had humiliated him in court, taken land he believed was rightfully his. He wrote about how God had delivered them into his hands for justice. The journal entries became more detailed and more disturbing. Silas described using old mining equipment, a pulley system and cart, to drag the dead horse and wagon into the mine, along with the body of the girl who had died in the accident. It had taken him all night, but he had managed it, hiding all evidence of the crash. But what he did with the surviving sister was even worse. The journal described how he had carried her back to his farmhouse. She was badly injured, with broken ribs, and a leg that was clearly fractured. She needed immediate medical attention. Instead, Silas had locked her in his root cellar, a hidden room beneath the main basement that he had discovered years earlier, and reinforced. The journal documented his twisted reasoning. He wrote that the girl was payment for what the Amish had taken from him. He convinced himself that keeping her prisoner was justified, that she deserved to suffer as he had suffered from their lawsuit. The entries over the following days and weeks described Sarah Stoltzfus's imprisonment in horrific detail. Silas wrote about her begging for help, for her family, for her sister Rebecca, who she didn't know was already dead. He wrote about her prayers, her attempts to maintain her faith even in captivity. He brought her minimal food and water, just enough to keep her alive. He never touched her in the way investigators had feared, but the psychological torture of isolation and the physical agony of untreated injuries were cruelty enough. The entries became less frequent as weeks turned to months. Silas wrote about Sarah growing quieter, weaker. Her injuries weren't healing properly without medical care. She developed infections. By December, according to the journal, she had stopped speaking entirely. In January 2006, 3 months after her capture, Silas wrote a brief entry saying only that the girl had died during the night. He described burying her in the dirt floor of the root cellar, covering the grave with old boards and debris. The journal continued for years after, but the entries about the Stoltzfus sisters were limited to occasional mentions, usually on the anniversary of their disappearance. Silas showed no remorse, only a twisted satisfaction that he had gotten his revenge on the Amish community. He wrote about following the news coverage, about the search efforts, about the grief of the family, and he took pleasure in all of it. In one of his final entries, written just months before his death, Silas had written that he was leaving the journal as his confession, that someday people would know what he had done and understand that he had been justified. He seemed to believe that history would vindicate him, that people would see him as a victim who had fought back against his oppressors. Armed with the journal's information, investigators returned to Silas's farmhouse with excavation equipment. The root cellar was exactly where the journal had described, hidden beneath a trapdoor that had been covered with a heavy workbench. The cellar itself was a nightmare made real, a small, windowless room with stone walls and a dirt floor. Even after all these years, the space felt oppressive, evil. The excavation team worked carefully, treating the cellar as both a crime scene and a grave. 3 feet down in the hard-packed earth, they found what they were looking for: human remains, still partially wrapped in what had once been a traditional Amish dress. The bones were carefully exhumed and sent for forensic analysis. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains were those of Sarah Stoltzfus. The forensic examination revealed the extent of her injuries: multiple broken ribs, a fractured femur that had begun to heal improperly, and damage to her spine that would have made movement agonizing. She had suffered for months before finally succumbing to what the medical examiner believed was pneumonia, likely brought on by the cold, damp conditions in her weakened state. The news of the discovery hit the Harmony Creek community like a thunderclap. After 10 years of not knowing, they finally had answers, but the answers were more horrible than anything they had imagined. The peaceful Amish community had to grapple with the reality that such evil had existed so close to them, that one man's hatred had destroyed 2 innocent lives and devastated a family. Esther Stoltzfus, now 83 and in failing health, was told about the discovery. Those present said she listened quietly, then asked to be taken to where her daughters had been found. Despite concerns about her health, her family agreed. She stood at the entrance to the mine where Rebecca's body had been hidden, then at the farmhouse where Sarah had suffered and died. She didn't speak, just stood in silent prayer at each location. The community came together to give the sisters a proper burial. Sarah and Rebecca Stoltzfus were laid to rest in the small Amish cemetery where their father already lay, simple wooden markers bearing only their names and dates. No mention of how they died, no acknowledgement of the horror they had endured. That wasn't the Amish way. The funeral was attended by hundreds, not just Amish but English neighbors who had been touched by the story. Even investigators who had worked the case came to pay their respects. In the midst of grief, the community also had to confront difficult questions. Should they have pushed harder for answers 10 years ago? Could they have done something different that might have saved Sarah? How could such hatred exist in one man's heart? The elders preached forgiveness, saying that even Silas Kane's soul was in God's hands now. But forgiveness was hard to find when faced with such deliberate cruelty. Some families installed locks on their doors for the first time, a small but significant departure from their traditional trust in providence. The investigators pieced together more details in the weeks that followed. They discovered that Silas had indeed been briefly questioned in 2005, as he lived relatively close to where the sisters had disappeared. But he had produced a receipt from a hardware store dated the day of the disappearance, showing he had been 50 miles away. Now they realized the receipt had been from a different date. The numbers had been altered. It was a simple forgery that had gone unnoticed in the initial investigation. They also found evidence that Silas had been watching the Amish community for years, keeping notes on families, their routines, their travels. The Stoltzfus sisters might not have been specifically targeted, but Silas had been waiting for an opportunity, and fate had delivered one to him in the form of a tragic accident. The discovery also raised questions about whether there might be other victims. Investigators searched the rest of the mines and Silas's property, but found no other human remains. They reviewed missing persons cases from the surrounding counties, looking for any connections to Silas Kane, but found none. It seemed the Stoltzfus sisters had been his only victims, though the investigators couldn't shake the feeling that a man capable of such evil might have done more that was never discovered. The case made national news, with reporters descending on Harmony Creek to cover the story. The Amish community, true to their nature, declined to speak to the media, preferring to grieve in private. But the story spread anyway, a cautionary tale about the danger of hatred left to fester, about the vulnerability of those who choose to live apart from modern society, about the persistence of evil in places where you'd least expect to find it. Mental health experts analyzed Silas's journal, trying to understand the psychology of a man who could find an injured teenager and choose not just to let her die, but to prolong her suffering for months. They spoke about isolation, paranoia, and the way grievances can transform into something monstrous when left to grow in darkness. Legal experts debated whether Silas's estate, meager as it was, should go to the Stoltzfus family as compensation. The family declined to pursue any claim, saying money couldn't bring back their daughters, and they wanted nothing that had belonged to such a man. The state eventually claimed the property, and there was talk of creating a memorial, but the Amish community requested that nothing be done to mark the site. They wanted to forget, not remember. As the months passed, life in Harmony Creek slowly returned to its rhythm. The case was closed, the questions answered, the bodies laid to rest. But the impact lingered. Parents held their children a little tighter. Neighbors checked on each other more frequently. The trust that had once been absolute was now tinged with caution. Young people were warned not just about the dangers of the English world, but about the evil that could exist even in their own backyard. Esther Stoltzfus lived for 6 more months after her daughters were found. Those who cared for her said she seemed more at peace in those final months, as if knowing what had happened, horrible as it was better than not knowing. She died in her sleep in the spring of 2016 and was buried beside her husband and daughters. The family reunited at last, in death. Her funeral was small, quiet, marked by prayers and hymns rather than speeches. The mine where Rebecca's body and the wagon had been hidden was sealed by the state, the entrance filled with concrete to prevent anyone from entering. The farmhouse where Sarah had been imprisoned was demolished, the root cellar filled in, the land left to return to nature. Within a few years, trees and brush had reclaimed the site, erasing the physical evidence of what had happened there. But the story lived on, passed down as a warning, a reminder that evil can hide behind any face. that hatred left unchecked can lead to unimaginable cruelty. The story of Sarah and Rebecca Stoltzfus became part of the fabric of Harmony Creek, woven into its history like a dark thread among lighter ones. New families moving to the area would eventually hear about it, told in quiet voices by neighbors who remembered. Children grew up knowing that two sisters had once disappeared on October Day, that they had been found 10 years later, that a bad man had hurt them. The details were often left vague for younger ears, but the message was clear. Be careful, stay together, come home before dark. Investigators who worked the case said it stayed with them long after the files were closed. The image of that wagon in the mine, the contents of that journal, the excavation of that cellar, these were things that haunted their dreams. Some sought counseling to deal with what they had seen and read. Others threw themselves into other cases, trying to find other missing persons, to give other families the closure the Stoltzfus family had finally received. The case also led to changes in how missing persons cases were handled in rural Pennsylvania. Better coordination between Amish communities and law enforcement was established. Cultural liaisons were appointed to help bridge the gap between the two worlds. The idea was that if something like this happened again, the response would be faster, more comprehensive. The Amish community, while still maintaining their separation from the modern world, became slightly more willing to work with outside authorities when necessary. Some members of the community struggled with their faith in the aftermath. How could God allow such suffering? Why had their prayers for the girl's safe return gone unanswered? The elders counseled that God's ways were mysterious, that suffering in this world was temporary, that Sarah and Rebecca were now at peace. But for some, especially those who had known the sisters personally, these words offered little comfort. Faith that had once been unshakable was now touched with doubt. Others found their faith strengthened by the tragedy. They spoke of Sarah's apparent devotion even in captivity, how, according to the journal, she had continued to pray even as she suffered. They saw her as a martyr of sorts, someone whose faith had been tested in the most extreme way possible and had not broken. Some families began naming their daughters Sarah or Rebecca, not in spite of what had happened, but because of it, honoring the memory of two girls whose lives had been cut short. The English community around Harmony Creek was also affected. Many had participated in the search efforts 10 years earlier, and learning the truth brought a mix of relief and horror. Some felt guilty that they hadn't done more, hadn't searched harder, hadn't somehow known that Silas Kane was capable of such evil. Others were angry that he had died before facing justice, that he had escaped earthly punishment for his crimes. Town meetings were held to discuss how to prevent such tragedies, though everyone knew that evil like Silas's was impossible to predict or prevent entirely. Local historians documented the case, recognizing its significance not just as a crime, but as a moment that had changed the community forever. They interviewed those willing to speak, collected newspaper clippings, preserved the official reports. The story of the Stoltzfus sisters became part of the official record, ensuring that future generations would know what had happened. Some argued this was important for preventing such tragedies. Others felt it was simply giving Silas Kane the attention he had craved. The 10th anniversary of the discovery, in 2025, was marked with a special service in Harmony Creek. By then, many of those who had known Sarah and Rebecca personally had passed away or moved on, but their story remained, a wound that had healed but left a scar. The service was simple, as all Amish services are, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper, a recognition that some events leave marks that time cannot erase. The community had survived, had continued, had maintained their faith and their way of life, but they had been changed. Young people who had been children when the sisters disappeared, who had grown up in the shadow of the mystery, now had children of their own. They faced the challenge of explaining the inexplicable, of warning without terrifying, of maintaining the delicate balance between trust and caution that their parents had struggled with. Some chose to say nothing until their children were older. Others told simplified versions of the story. A few were completely honest, believing that knowledge, even painful knowledge, was better than ignorance. The site of the Stoltzfus farm, sold after Jacob's death, had been purchased by a young Amish couple who knew its history. They had debated whether to buy it, whether living on land touched by such tragedy was wise. But they had decided that the land itself was not to blame, that making it a home again was a form of healing. They raised their children there, grew crops, tended animals, lived the life that Sarah and Rebecca should have been able to live. Sometimes visitors who knew the story would drive by slowly, looking for some sign of the tragedy that had started there. They found only a normal Amish farm, peaceful and productive, life continuing as it always had. The case files eventually made their way to the state archives, boxes of documents and evidence that told the story in clinical detail, forensic photos of the mine, the wagon, the cellar, transcripts of interviews, the journal itself, preserved as evidence of a crime that could no longer be prosecuted. Occasionally, researchers or journalists would request access, writing articles or studies about the case. Each retelling brought new perspectives but couldn't change the fundamental horror of what had happened. Law enforcement training programs began using the case as an example of how missing persons investigations could go wrong. The altered receipt that had given Silas his alibi became a textbook example of why every piece of evidence needed to be thoroughly verified. The failure to search abandoned properties in the area more thoroughly was cited as a missed opportunity. The case became a teaching tool, its lessons paid for with 2 young lives. The Amish community's response to the tragedy was studied by sociologists and religious scholars. How did a community built on forgiveness deal with unforgivable acts? How did people who rejected modern technology and law enforcement learn to work with both when necessary? The answers were complex, varying from family to family, but the overall picture was of a community that had bent without breaking, that had adapted without abandoning their core beliefs. Some good did come from the tragedy, though no one would say it was worth the price. The improved cooperation between the Amish and local authorities helped solve other cases, find other missing persons, prevent other tragedies. The awareness of how isolation could breed dangerous obsessions led to better monitoring of individuals who showed signs of violent fixation. Mental health resources, while still largely rejected by the Amish themselves, became more available in the surrounding communities. The story also highlighted the vulnerability of closed communities, how their separation from mainstream society could make them targets for those who resented or misunderstood them. This led to difficult conversations within the Amish community about how much engagement with the outside world was necessary for safety. Some argued for more integration, others for less, but all agreed that the world had become more dangerous than their grandparents could have imagined. As the years passed, the sharp edges of grief softened into a dull ache for those who remembered Sarah and Rebecca. Their contemporaries married, had children, grew old, always carrying the shadow of what had happened to their friends. Sometimes at gatherings, someone would mention a memory: Rebecca's laugh, Sarah's quilting, the way they had sung together during church services. These memories were precious, untainted by what came after, preserved like photographs in the minds of those who had known them. The English teenager who had taken the last photograph of the sisters at the market just weeks before they disappeared had been deeply affected when she learned their fate. She had kept the photograph, unable to throw it away, feeling somehow responsible for preserving their image. Years later, as an adult, she had it professionally restored and donated it to the County Historical Society, ensuring that Sarah and Rebecca would be remembered as they had lived, not just as they had died. The Harmony Creek Amish community developed new traditions around safety without explicitly acknowledging why. Young people traveling to market were encouraged to go in groups. Families checked on each other more frequently. Routes to and from town were varied, never falling into patterns that could be observed and exploited. These weren't rules exactly, more like collective habits born from hard-learned wisdom. The mine where the wagon had been hidden became a place of dark pilgrimage for some, despite being sealed. People would leave flowers at the concrete barrier or simply stand and reflect on what had happened in the darkness beyond. The state eventually posted no trespassing signs and installed security cameras after some individuals attempted to break through the seal, drawn by morbid curiosity. The site had to be checked regularly to prevent it from becoming a macabre tourist attraction. The story spread beyond Pennsylvania, becoming part of the broader narrative about violence against isolated communities. It was cited in academic papers, referenced in true crime documentaries, and discussed in online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries, even though this one had been solved. Each retelling risked sensationalizing the tragedy, turning Sarah and Rebecca into symbols rather than remembering them as real girls who had lived, laughed, and died too young. Within the Amish community, there was debate about how to remember the sisters. Some wanted to forget, to let time heal the wounds completely. Others argued that forgetting dishonored their memory and risked repeating the mistakes that had allowed the tragedy to happen. The compromise was typically Amish: remember privately, speak rarely, and focus on the living rather than the dead. The story became a cautionary tale that parents told in vague terms to children who wanted more freedom than was safe. It joined the oral tradition of the community, alongside stories of persecution in Europe, of the journey to America, of the challenges of maintaining their way of life in an increasingly modern world. Each generation would know that two sisters had disappeared, had been found, had been mourned, and that evil could wear any face. Investigators who had worked the case often wondered what would have happened if the mine had never been explored. Would the truth have remained buried forever? Would the Stoltzfus family have gone to their graves never knowing what happened to their daughters? In some ways, not knowing might have been easier than knowing the truth, but closure, even painful closure, was generally believed to be better than eternal uncertainty. The journal that had revealed everything was eventually destroyed, burned after being thoroughly documented for the legal record. There had been debate about preserving it as a historical artifact, but the decision was made that Silas Kane's words didn't deserve preservation. His thoughts, his twisted justifications, his detailed account of Sarah's suffering, these things didn't need to exist in the world. The facts were recorded, the evidence preserved, but his voice was silenced. Rebecca's death in the initial accident was, in its way, a mercy compared to what her sister endured. This thought tortured those who learned the details of the case. The randomness of it, if the wagon had fallen slightly differently, if Sarah had been the one to die instantly, if neither had died in the crash and Silas had found them both alive. The what-ifs were endless and pointless, but human nature made them impossible to avoid. The horse, Samuel, was remembered too. The faithful animal who had served the family for years, who had made the trip to market countless times, who had died trying to avoid a deer on a mountain road. His remains were eventually removed from the mine and buried on what had been the Stoltzfus farm, a small gesture of respect for a creature who had been part of the family's daily life. The supplies the girls had purchased that day were found in the wagon, preserved by the mine's dry environment, fabric that would have become winter clothes, lamp oil for dark evenings, feed for animals that had long since been sold, small treats, hard candies, and a new book that suggested the market day had been successful. These items were returned to Esther before her death, tangible connections to her daughter's last normal day. The vendors at the Millgrove Market who had been among the last to see the sisters alive carried their own burden of memory. They remembered the girls as cheerful, polite, good at bargaining, but fair in their dealings. Some wondered if they had noticed anything unusual that day, any sign of danger, any indication that something terrible was about to happen. But there had been nothing. It had been an ordinary day that had ended in extraordinary horror. The community's relationship with the outside world was forever altered by the case. While they maintained their traditional ways, there was now an awareness that isolation could be dangerous, that sometimes engaging with modern systems was necessary for safety. This was a difficult balance to strike for a people whose identity was built on separation from the world, but they managed it with the same quiet determination that had carried them through centuries of challenge. Children born after the discovery grew up in a subtly different Harmony Creek than the one Sarah and Rebecca had known. The changes were small. A few more phones and barns for emergencies, more frequent check-ins with English authorities, a greater willingness to report concerns. But the fundamental character of the community remained unchanged. They still valued simplicity, community, and faith above all else. The story reached Amish communities in other states, spreading through the network of family connections and church relationships that linked settlements across the country. Each community took its own lessons from what had happened, implementing their own subtle changes to prevent similar tragedies. The Stoltzfus sisters became known far beyond Harmony Creek, their story a reminder of vulnerability and the need for vigilance. Some journalists and authors wanted to write books about the case, to explore it in greater detail, to perhaps find some meaning in the senseless tragedy. The Amish community uniformly refused to cooperate with such projects, feeling that turning their grief into entertainment was wrong. This didn't stop some books from being written, but without the participation of those who had known Sarah and Rebecca best, they remained incomplete, focusing on the sensational rather than the human elements of the story. The discovery of what had happened to the sisters also raised questions about other unsolved disappearances in Amish communities across the country. Were there other Silas Kanes out there, harboring hatred and looking for opportunities? Were there other victims waiting to be found? These questions led to reviews of cold cases, new searches of abandoned properties, and a few other mysteries being solved, though none as dramatic as the Stoltzfus case. The psychological impact on the community was studied by researchers interested in how closed societies process trauma. The Amish way of dealing with grief, through faith, community support, and routine, proved remarkably effective for most. But there were those who struggled, who found their faith shaken, who needed help that their traditional support systems couldn't provide. Slowly, carefully, bridges were built to mental health resources that respected Amish values while providing necessary care. The case became a reference point in discussions about religious minorities and their relationship with broader society. How much protection should isolated communities have? How much integration should be required for safety? These were questions without easy answers, but the Stoltzfus case provided a concrete example of what could go wrong when communities were too isolated to protect their most vulnerable members. As technology advanced and the world changed around them, the Amish of Harmony Creek held to their traditions while making small accommodations to safety. GPS trackers were discreetly placed in some buggies. Cell phones were kept in barns for emergencies. These changes were never formally acknowledged, but they were understood as necessary evils in a world that had proven itself capable of unimaginable cruelty. The story of Sarah and Rebecca Stoltzfus ended not with their deaths, but with the slow, difficult work of a community learning to live with tragedy. It ended with families holding each other closer, with neighbors watching out for one another, with a people of faith grappling with the existence of evil. It ended not with answers, for how can there be answers to such senseless loss, but with the determination to continue, to remember, and to protect those who remained. This is a story that reminds us that evil can hide in plain sight, that hatred left to fester can lead to monstrous acts, that the most peaceful communities are not immune to violence. It reminds us that sometimes accidents become opportunities for those with darkness in their hearts, that the vulnerable need protection, that justice delayed is still justice denied. But it also reminds us of the strength of community, the power of truth even when it comes too late, and the importance of never giving up on the missing. The Stoltzfus sisters were just two young Amish women going to market on an autumn day. They should have come home to help with dinner, to do their evening chores, to say their prayers, and go to bed in the room they shared. Instead, they became part of a story that would haunt a community for generations, a reminder that safety is never guaranteed, that evil exists, and that some mysteries, when solved, bring more pain than peace. Yet their story also stands as testament to the dogged pursuit of truth, the refusal to let the missing be forgotten, and the importance of answers, no matter how terrible they might be. What did you think of this incredible story? The truth behind the disappearance of Sarah and Rebecca Stoltzfus shows us that sometimes reality is more horrifying than anything we could imagine. Their story serves as a sobering reminder of how a single moment can change everything, how evil can lurk behind the most ordinary faces, and how communities must balance tradition with safety in an unpredictable world. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable true stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the world around us.